New year, same showdown in Sudan. Or is it? Sunday's resignation of civilian Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok deprives coup leaders there of the face of continuity between the revolution that toppled longtime strongman Omar el-Bachir in 2019 and a junta that since scrapped power sharing and jailed key architects of the transition to democracy. Why did Hamdok quit? Why now? Does his departure in any way tip the scales? In a brutal showdown where protesters continue to defy a lethal crackdown on dissent, how to make the military return to barracks when it's held the reins of political and economic power for so long. To break out of its isolation, this junta has cut deals with armed groups at home and courted foreign powers abroad. How much clout do the likes of Egypt and the Gulf states have? Or the US and Europe, for that matter? They've been pressing the coup leaders to concede. With the fighting raging in neighboring Ethiopia, the last thing the world wants is a second civil war in the Horn of Africa. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at that post-coup showdown in Sudan. Joining us from Nairobi, el-Bachir, managing partner at consultancy and advocacy group Insight Strategy Partner. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Also in our company is activist Firas Faisal. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
He's a retired diplomat who used to be Washington's man in Khartoum. Alberto Miguel Fernandez, Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute, joins us from Washington. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We reached out, by the way, to Sudanese authorities and to the embassy here in Paris without success this time. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Abdullah Hamdok had been threatening to throw in the towel for weeks. He made it official on Sunday.
فإنني قد قررت أن أرد إليكم أمانتكم وأعلن لكم استقالتي من منصب رئيس الوزراء مفسحا المجال لآخر من بنات أو أبناء هذا الوطن المعطاء وحتى بعد انقلاب 25 من أكتوبر قمنا بتوقيع اتفاق إطاري مع المكون العسكري في محاولة لإعادة مسار التحول المدني الديمقراطي وحقن الدماء وإطلاق سراح المعتقلين. أدعوني أشكر في هذا المقام كل الأصدقاء في كل دول العالم وكل الشعوب المحبة للحرية والسلام والعدالة.
Yeah, those are the words of Abdalla Hamdok, a respected international servant, before taking the reins back in 2019, again, as a man of consensus. He knew it was going to be a tightrope act, leading a transitional government split between soldiers and civilians. More from Karis Garland.
Sworn in August 2019, Abdalla Hamdok became the first civilian Sudanese prime minister in 30 years. The veteran economist was tasked with leading Sudan's transitional government after the ousting of longtime leader Omar al-Bashir. But all was not smooth sailing. On October 25, 2021, the military seized power, detaining Hamdok and other members of his cabinet. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan said he led the coup to prevent civil war, but the power grab sparked weeks of mass protests. Hamdok was eventually released and reinstated on November 21, but this meant signing a deal with the army.
هذا الاتفاق يساعد على فك الاختناق. نتمنى فك الاختناق الداخلي والخارجي ونستعيد مسار الانتقال لتحقيق ديمقراطية مستدامة في بلدنا.
Not long after signing it, Hamdok said he would quit if the Sudanese people didn't think the agreement served their interests. It called for the release of political prisoners, an investigation into violence during protests, and protection of freedom of expression. Members of the Sudanese pro-democracy movement saw the deal as a betrayal and continued to protest the military's involvement in politics. Scores of people have died in crackdowns on the demonstrations. Born in Sudan's south in 1956, Hamdok has had a long career in public service. In the 80s, he worked as a senior official for Sudan's finance ministry before holding a number of leadership roles, like at the African Development Bank and the UN's Economic Commission for Africa.
el-Bachir, the last time you were on the show, you did not mince words when it came to Abdullah Hamdok. What's your opinion of him after the events of the last 24 hours?
I think he did the right thing. I think it became very obvious that he wasn't able to exercise his roles and his duties within the executive space that he was allowed following the coup. I think it's pretty clear now that the transitional period ended on the 25th of October, the day of the coup itself. And so essentially he was part of a puppet regime that was, designed to sort of sanitize what the coup regime had been doing since the 25th, and arguably even before then. And so now that that fig leaf is removed, he has enabled a better discussion to take place. And that discussion isn't whether or not he should be given more time or whether or not he will stay or go. Those are sort of distractions. The real conversation is what to do now to ensure that the military goes back to the barracks and a proper transition can take place.
A proper transition can take place, but we have had lots of reactions saying this was the conduit to make the military perhaps go away quietly. I can read to you, for instance, the tweet put out by the UK's junior minister in charge of Africa policy, Vicky Ford, saying she's deeply saddened. He was serving Sudan and its people. Millions have raised their voices since the 25th of October coup to demand civilian rule. So the idea being, again, that this was a way to make things happen without a bloodbath.
No, with all my respect to international diplomats working on Sudan, I think there's been a rather lazy telephone diplomacy that has been taking place in terms of the way that the Sudanese and foreign relationships have been working. And what Hamdok served to do was to sort of, present them with a sort of a justified way of saying that there is a transition taking place, even when everything on the ground suggested otherwise. And so now that he's gone, that sort of narrative can no longer hold. And that's something that should be celebrated because it allows us to have a meaningful conversation, even with the international community, about what steps need to be taken next, provided that they listen to the right quarters from the pro-democracy movement.
All right, whether that conversation can take place, I'm going to put it to the rest of the panel. But first, let's talk about the timing of the announcement. Ahead of Hamdok's resignation came a speech on Saturday by the coup leader. Let's listen to General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan.
Individuals with authority, along with the current conflict which has resulted in loss of life, damage to property and disruption, mean we have to arbitrate the voice of reason and agree to dialogue.
Firas Faisal, how did you interpret those words on Saturday?
Well, I believe that they were very obvious. He's calling out to negotiate because he has been pressured so much by the protesters on the ground. And I think that he saw Hamdok's resignation coming on the way because, well, we as Sudanese people, our initial thoughts about the Hamdok and the junta deal were negative. We only thought that it was just a way of legitimizing the coup that took place on the 25th of October. But we kept on protesting. People kept on fighting and pressuring the junta. So now the junta wants to sit down and talk. But obviously that's not going to happen because what we can see on the ground now is just an increasing pace of protest.
Who would they talk with if there were talks?
Well, right now, the dominant party on the ground is the Sudanese resistance committees that were formed by the revolutionaries themselves. And those are the people controlling the protests and the civilian movement right now. So I think those are the right people to talk to if you want to reach anywhere. But
well, let me ask you about this, Firas, because when last time we were speaking to Khalud, there were divisions among civilians over whether it was better to continue a dialogue or not. Right now, are those out in the streets, and there were people out in the streets again on Sunday, are they singing from the same hymn sheet?
There are absolutely no divisions now. Everyone is completely convinced that democracy and the junta cannot coexist in a single regime. The military belongs to the barracks, and that's where they have to be.
On the streets of Khartoum this Monday, those who accused Hamdok of doing deals with the devil, giving way to a certain degree to those praising the respected international civil servant after he tendered his resignation.
Hamdok sent a message to all, and it is to step down if someone cannot take on a task. This is the best lesson. It has never happened in Sudan's history for a person to come out and frankly admit his defeat to the people.
We have been expecting Hamdok's resignation for a year now. Firstly, because if someone lost something, then they cannot give it back. Secondly, because Sudanese women have given birth to thousands of men like Hamdok. So I think the people are not tied to one person only. Sudan is full of patriotic men.
All right, so we're all replaceable. Alberto Fernandez was the word of that man there. Your thoughts of what you're hearing so far on Abdullah Hamdok's quote unquote legacy in this time when he was prime minister between 2019 and now?
Well, I think he was a decent man. He is a well-intentioned man, a patriot. He did, I think, some very good things for Sudan in some very difficult 2 years. His worst mistake was accepting the bad advice he received from advisors and from the international community to go along with the November 21st agreement with the military. That was a politically fatal mistake. And he bears blame for that, but of course he's not the only one. I agree with Khulud and others that it kind of, the international community took the easy way out, especially the West took the easy way out and kind of put the burden on Hamdok's shoulders to try to make this deal with the devil work. And that was very unlikely to work. And in fact, you know, the time between November 21st and now was a time when the military was given opportunities to basically strengthen its hold on power. It hasn't fully succeeded, but it basically gained something when Hamdok entered this deal with them.
Hindsight is 2020, and obviously we've seen this movie before in other places like Egypt, where the military never goes away and then it comes back to haunt the civilians. In the case of Sudan, though, remember, it was not an easy feat toppling Omar el-Bachir.
That's true, and you know, the heroism of the thousands of Sudanese, the revolutionaries in 2018 and going back even farther, 2018 and 2019. Was eventually matched by, you know, what happens in these situations, which was the military cracked, and the military decided that it was best served to be on the side of the revolution and against the regime. But unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 2 years is that, as a famous Sudanese once said, it seems like the Sudanese military is, you know, too deformed to be reformed, right? It's not willing to go back to the barracks, or at least it's not convinced yet that it has to go back to the barracks.
Now, you served in Sudan from 2007 to 2009. I mentioned Egypt. Is it the same where it just seems that the military is so embedded, both in the political and the economic life, that they'll never go away?
There's a difference. There are similarities between the two militaries, but Sudan has certainly over the last decades, more experience in kind of civil society and democratic processes than in Egypt. In Egypt, you've had these kind of authoritarian regimes since the time of Nasser, one succeeding another. One general succeeding another since the 1950s. Whereas Sudan, certainly you've had the military overthrowing civilian governments, but there have been civilian governments in Sudan. There have been democratic elections. There has been a kind of pluralism that comes from the street in Sudan, which is a very precious thing in Africa and a very precious thing in countries that speak Arabic.
Khulud Khair, sitting here in Paris, we, of course, look at how events have unfolded just across the Mediterranean in Algeria since the period where Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. And we've seen how, you know, the generals are good at playing the waiting game. Now, with what's just unfolded, do you have the feeling that you have a strong or a weak hand?
I think the civilian bloc has the stronger hand for sure. And that's because the military bloc, and we should probably call it that because it is made up of different security and military and paramilitary actors. It is not one cohesive body. And this again makes it different to other contexts, including Egypt. But this military bloc is only sort of held together now by a common objectives. And those common objectives largely need money to make it work. And of course, Sudan right now is not getting access to any grants or loans or even debt relief that would allow it to access further funding. And so I expect that would disintegrate very quickly once the money does not materialize. And so even, it's two things. It's the strength of the civilian sector, the fact that we have seen a resolute street come out and in many ways be the most astute political player throughout the past 3 years and sort of be able to preempt and adapt and evolve along with the political developments. And on the other side, we have an increasingly weakened and increasingly weaker and underfunded military bloc that is unable to hold itself together. We're already seeing sort of the starting of and also the remnants of conflicts in Darfur, and they have a very direct link to the center. And there will be a feedback loop between those two things. So while the security context disintegrates, the civilians should be able to at least make some gains as the military becomes increasingly more desperate to gain a foothold.
It could get a lot uglier even than it is now, Firas Faisal. We've had, there were 2 killed at least on Sunday, perhaps more in the clashes that took place in Khartoum's Twin City. The protests have been deadly oftentimes since the October coup. The economic pain that you heard there, Kholoud describe for the military, ordinary citizens are feeling it too, no?
Definitely. One of the main objectives of the civilian movement is to drain the military economically so that they wouldn't be able to stick together further. However, I think that carrying on this plan will have some setbacks because the military keeps getting funds from other countries that they were never pro-democratic in Sudan, like the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, because for them it's a matter of existence. Because if Sudan has managed to have a democratic transition, that would pose a very serious threat to the continuity of their regime. So I think that they are willing to go to extremes to keep supporting the Sudanese junta.
Well, let's put that to Alberto Fernandez. Is there evidence of that, of Gulf states and Egypt going to extremes to support the junta?
Well, I think there's a lot of smoke. The question is how much fire. I think there are gradations of support. For example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with the U.S. and the U.K., issued statements supporting kind of a transition to civilian rule. At least they said that. And Saudi Arabia, in fact, condemned the coup in the first days of the October 25th coup. There are other countries that have been more silent, like Egypt, like Russia, for example, who I think are more in favor of the coup. I think there's a certain ambivalence that occurs in other places. And the other place where, unfortunately, there's a certain ambivalence is, of course, in the West, where there's a temptation in the West, in the United States, and in other places, to kind of accept process over results, which is an old problem in Sudan from the Bashir regime. And that basically you have a process, and even though it's a flawed process with these generals calling the shots, we'll see where the process goes. That's a very dangerous situation. You don't want to give more oxygen to the military than it already has.
Yeah, but it's always damned if you do, damned if you don't, because then you get called an imperialist if you turn up the temperature too high.
Sure, but the Troika, the United States, and other countries have a long relationship with Sudan. And, Sudan is a sovereign state. The United States is a sovereign state as well. And so if the United States decided, for example, to have targeted sanctions against the coup leaders and go after their sources of wealth worldwide, the U.S. is a sovereign nation and can do that, and people can call it whatever they want.
Khalid Khair, we had the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State to Nairobi, where you are. Sudan was on the menu when that happened. Your thoughts? What role for the United States, and what could the United States be doing differently?
Well, I mean, I remember that when Secretary Blinken was in the region, people were sort of cautious about his coming to Sudan because previously the envoy had come and the next day there was a coup, and then the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa had come and the next day there was a massacre. And so clearly the military was sort of goading the United States in many ways and sort of following up any high-level visits with a sort of a grand gesture, if you will. And so there was some trepidation about his coming. Now, the problem with his not coming, I would say, was that it sort of signaled that Sudan was not an important part of the U.S. Foreign policy.
He should have gone to Khartoum?
I think if he had gone to Khartoum with a process, with a sequence of follow-up events in place, it would have made a difference. But if he was just going to come in, shake a few hands and then leave, then it's best he hadn't come. And I think that's the problem. There is a sense of expediency to foreign policy, particularly from the West. Not that is expected from other quarters, including the Gulf, but from countries that, sort of pronounce this commitment to democratic values, we're not really seeing any of that actually materialize. And that's, I think, what the problem is.
But back in October, after the coup in Sudan, there was the think tank Crisis Group, which put out a report where it most notably urged the West to use its pull with the likes, we've been mentioning them, of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, saying in that memo, the U.S. and the EU should use the considerable leverage they have with Gulf capitals in Cairo to convince them to push the generals in Khartoum to change course. Alberto Fernandez, do we know any more about A, what's been going on in the back channels since October, and B, how much pull do they really have?
Well, we do know that there's been a lot of traffic, a lot of contact and discussion. How much pull? That is a very good question. I mean, one of the challenges you have, I know Sudan is not a Middle Eastern country, it's an African country, but one of the things that you see when it comes, for example, to U.S. foreign policy in the broader Middle East is what Brett McGurk has called the back to basics policy, which basically means dealing with the status quo, dealing with dictators, a kind of a minimalist foreign policy, which is all talk and no action, which is not coercive. And of course, all of the things I've described now are music to the ears of despots and of the generals in Khartoum. So the discussion is occurring. There's certainly everyone's talking to everyone else. But my fear is that Washington, given the region, given, for example, civil war and genocide in Ethiopia, as you all mentioned at the beginning, that decision makers have written Sudan off as a problem, but not as big of a problem as, say, Ethiopia or Iran or whatever.
But let me ask you, as a former State Department diplomat, can Washington, or for that matter, can we here in Europe handle having two full-on civil wars, if that were to be the case, in both Ethiopia and Sudan?
Well, of course, this is what the military always says. And of course, not just in Sudan. This has been the story of the region forever, right? It's either me or chaos. So you, the West, have to support me, General so-and-so, to prevent chaos. Of course, that's always a risk. But the idea that a kind of bankrupt military dictatorship is going to be any kind of guarantee for security is a fool's errand. And of course, we saw that in Sudan's own history. What did the Bashir regime do? Bashir regime was an Islamist regime and had dealings first with Al-Qaeda and then was an ally of Iran and of Hamas and, went from place to place to place looking for support and looking for money and was certainly a pole and center of instability in Africa and the Middle East, not of stability. So it's a dirty game that people play by saying, oh, we have to support the status quo or there will be chaos. There will be chaos with these guys in charge.
Firas Faisal, that brings us back to what we've been talking about at the outset, which is the feeling on the street. Is this something that the international community is expected to do something, or are the Sudanese not talking about that right now?
Well, to be very honest, we have really lost hope in any international support because we've been fighting for this for many years now. And as everyone said, that the international community just chose to go the easy way and support the generals in order to avoid the possibility of chaos in our country. So we think that this is an internal conflict, and we have enough power to solve it as Sudanese people. If we kept doing what we're doing and we kept fighting these dictators, we can eventually push them away, even if we lost life, because we have already given enough sacrifices. We have already given sacrifices, and we are willing to give more sacrifices just to fulfill the goals of our revolution.
Right now, it's a crackdown on peaceful demonstrators. What are the chances it could become a full-blown civil war?
Well, I think there isn't really a big chance of that happening because, as you said, protesters are peaceful. They're not carrying arms, and we are not willing to resort to violence in order to have what we want. Actually, we are out on the streets resenting violence, so we're not going to resort to violence. The violence comes from people who already have the weapons.
But it's been a long struggle. It's been since 2018 that it's been going on. How longer can people hold out? What are tangible signs that they're willing to dig in for more?
Well, the answer to your question is everywhere online. If you watch the videos of these demonstrations, you will be able to sense how far we're willing to go in order to have democracy in our country. And it has been going, I think, from before 2018. In 2013, we were demonstrating and we were oppressed as well. But we kept on going until we toppled el-Bachir's regime, which wasn't a very easy thing to do. So now, with that experience, we have more trust in ourselves and we have more faith than ever that we are going to succeed eventually.
Khalid Hayir, the junta has also learned lessons from the events of 2018, making sure that you couldn't have sit-ins like the one you had outside the main military barracks in Khartoum this time around. If both sides are learning lessons, then are we just headed for this spiral? How to make this a peaceful transition for what you wish away from military rule?
I think the problem on the military side is that they have made a series of miscalculations, which isn't the case on the civilian side. The military continues to undermine and sort of not be able to grapple with the extent of the determination on the civilian side. I think the military generals sort of only talk in echo chambers, and they've been getting some really bad advice, potentially domestically, but probably also internationally. And that advice seems to look like, dig your heels in. They will give in at some point, which frankly isn't borne out by reality. But also, the more they dig in and the more repressive tactics they demonstrate, the harder it will be for their international actors to continue to support them because they become a reputational risk. By contrast, the protesters, the more they dig in, the more determination they show, and the more they're able to hold out, the more international acclaim they get. It is not the same rule for both of them. So, I think the military will come to realize pretty soon, like it did in 2019, that it will have to concede somewhere. And I think that is the sort of break that is required, whether that comes purely from a domestic pressure or from international pressure being exerted too, although I have very little faith in that as far as then at least I expect that to happen sometime soon, because they are the ones with whom the buck stops effectively, and they are the ones who now, without Hamdok, will face the entire blame for any and all violence meted out by the state.
And at what point, because we played that clip at the outset of General al-Burhan's calling for dialogue, at what point do you take him up on his offer?
Well, I mean, the Burhan and the military in general have been very good at buying time. They bought a lot of time during the coup. They bought a lot of latitude during the coup. They have continued to buy latitude and time as the coup is still continuing. And so, this sort of these calls for dialogue without any real meaningful, intention behind them is just another means of buying time. And I think protesters understand this. There will come a time, I suspect, that they will have to concede to some sort of concessions to the protesters, but it doesn't feel like that time is now. This feels like an opportunistic move.
And so at what point how do you avoid then going down the road of it becoming more and more violent? You can't turn the other cheek forever if you're being shot out in the street.
Well, the protesters aren't turning the other cheek. They are wedded to a set of principles of non-violent resistance. That's a very different thing. And what the military needs to understand is that resistance on their side to concede begets further resistance on the civilian side. And, you hear things such as, we outnumber them, they can't kill us all, we've done this before, we've got all year if we need to. People really do prioritize. And bearing in mind that protests have a high social and economic cost, but people have really stuck to their values on this one. And I think the military underestimates to what extent people don't like to see them in the political and economic sphere. There's a new population, there's a new demographic, 70% of the country is under 35. They don't have that sense of respect for the military that their forebears did. And that's another miscalculation that the military keeps making.
Yeah, that generation gap is key, Alberto Fernandez. So is the fact that we've been, perhaps in this conversation, falling into the trap of focusing on events in the capital, Khartoum. But Sudan is a very wide and diverse country.
Indeed, and what we're seeing is the same repression that we see in Khartoum is happening in the countryside, and the demonstrations, the protests, are nationwide in Sudan and in the Sudanese diaspora. So it really is a mass movement. I think the risk here is that the military regime, will try to somehow pick people off. I don't mean pick them off violently, although they will do that, but kind of find puppets, maybe among politicians or others, to try to buy more time, more whitewashing, more cover to kind of keep themselves in power. So it is important for certainly the protest movements to stay together and to not fall into any kind of regime trap, which they will certainly try to pick people off and divide and conquer.
Try to divide and conquer. And we know that some of those arrested in the October coup are still under house arrest. When Hamdok emerges from under, well, some are in jail, in fact. When Hamdok emerges from house arrest to take up the mantle a second time after the coup to be the interim prime minister, did you get a sense of why he was doing it?
Well, he said so. First of all, I was one of those who said this was, you mentioned hindsight. I was one of those who said that the November 21st agreement was a big mistake and that it was going to turn out the way it turned out. So some of us saw this coming. Many Sudanese certainly saw this coming for a while. He said he did it to stop the loss of blood, to stop people being killed, which is a laudable goal, that he was going to hold the military to account to this agreement. But it was very clear from the beginning the military was not going to meet the rules of this agreement, and that the West especially was not going to be punitive against the generals. There was a debate in Washington about going after the generals or not, and the people who basically wanted to do nothing are the ones who won.
So with Hamdok gone, are sanctions next?
that would be a logical supposition, but we haven't seen any evidence that the administration, the American administration, the Biden administration, is getting ready to do that. Maybe it is. But certainly we have calls from the U.S. Congress very much calling for action, targeted sanctions, action against the junta.
There's a communique that's come out in the last hour. I'll read it to you, Firas Faisal, from the French Foreign Ministry, praising Hamdok for what he's done and calling for the restoration of institutions of transition that are representative of the democratic aspirations of the Sudanese people. End quote. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that this is, I'm not really sure what they mean by restoration, because do they mean like take back the situation to where it was before the 25th of October? That's not going to happen. It's unrealistic. Praising Hamdok is not really music to the ears for a lot of Sudanese people, because after the 21st of November agreement, I think Hamdok pretty much committed political suicide, because everyone was not as supportive as they were for him before. So I'm really not sure what that statement means.
Well, I'll read you the next sentence. It says, only the nomination of a government that's representative and credible will enable to answer these aspirations, to appease the political climate, and to lead Sudan towards the organization of elections in 2023. Your thoughts?
Well, that's true. We do need a nominated government, but we still do not have a clear course of action on how to do that, because with the generals in the picture here, we are not going to be able to hold any elections, or at least credible elections, and to choose who we want to govern Sudan for the upcoming years.
Khaloud Hayer, you seem to mention that, or seem to imply earlier in one of your answers, that things might come to a head sooner than we think?
Yes, I mean, I think what everyone's reading is that they have a sense that the military can't, as the only power left in the country, can't sustain this crisis for long. And so whether that comes, I mean, and as you said before, we have to look at Khartoum, and we have to look at what happens in the rural areas, what happens in places like that, Darfur, conflict-affected areas as well. I think the bow breaking, as it were, may look different in different parts of the country, the East particularly as well, because of the sensitive political dynamics there. So things may come to a head, whether that reverberates across the country or is concentrated in specific areas, that remains to be seen. There are so many moving parts to this and so many moving actors, which is why I think a one-size-fits-all approach is just not going to cut it with this. And I mean, I think I share, Ferraz's confusion about some of these statements that are coming out from the international community, because none of them really have a good read on what's going on in the country, whether that's because they don't have adequate representation in country, or whether because they have weak foreign policy teams. I'm not really sure, or whether it is this disinterest that Alberto mentioned earlier. All of these things sort of create a perfect storm that has so far allowed the generals to basically be able to enact whatever policies they want to. And what we have seen is that they have reverted back to the Bashir playbook. And for me, this sends a very clear signal that, as Alberto was saying earlier, that instability that the Bashir regime sort of cultivated is something we're going to see more of in the future.
Khaloud, you said disinterest, but I mean, you're sitting in Nairobi, and everybody in Africa and everybody in Europe is well aware that you have a crisis in your native Sudan, but also in neighboring Ethiopia right now. There's no disinterest.
I mean, there's a public disinterest and a lack of information is one thing, but I'm talking about people who decide policy. Most of the people who work on Sudan in all of these particularly Western spheres, also work on Ethiopia. And then you do get that dynamic that Alberto mentioned earlier, which is that if things don't look as bad as they do in Ethiopia and Sudan, then it's okay to sort of allow the generals a bit of latitude. And, as far as international leaders holding each other responsible, that is probably not the right policy to pursue, because every country has its own dynamic. In Sudan, unlike in many other contexts, you have a very fertile pro-democracy, independent pro-democracy movement that actually does not require international support in terms of funding or in terms of sort of the mechanics of that. What it does require is political support at the highest level to enable that movement to have the time it needs to create the democratic environment that everyone needs. And so, I think the sort of lazy approach to Sudan has meant that actually international leaders and policymakers don't see that they actually need to do very little in Sudan to be very effective, but they're not even doing that.
All right, Khaloud Khair, I want to thank you so much for joining us from the Kenyan capital. Firas Faisal, who is in Khartoum, Alberto Miguel Fernandez in Washington. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.